In San Francisco, the city's so nice you'll step in poop twice. There's an area where homeless people were urinating and defecating, and it was starting to annoy the people breaking into cars. So the city tried to build a public toilet last year, but then gave up when the cost hit $1.7 million. Not $1.7 million for a public toilet system, $1.7 million for one toilet. And this wasn't some magic toilet that catches your phone when you drop. It's no wonder that in 2021, San Francisco issued only 2,000 permits for new homes. Sure, there are people living in the streets, but that's because we want to make sure the apartments they don't live in are perfect. I don't fear AI anymore because it couldn't possibly be any more robotic than the humans who run things now.
San Francisco is often presented as one of America's great cities, known for its natural beauty, historic landmarks, cultural influence, and enormous economic power. It's a place associated with innovation, opportunity, and global relevance. At the same time, it has become a frequent reference point in conversations about urban dysfunction, not because of one isolated problem, but because of the gap between what the city has and how it appears to function. Before politics or ideology even enter the discussion, Maher frames San Francisco as a city that seems unable to translate its wealth and influence into basic stability, which naturally leads people to ask how that disconnect developed. In this segment, Maher approaches the issue less like a policy analyst and more like a satirist demanding accountability. He doesn't soften the critique or ease into possible solutions. Instead, he uses humor to draw attention to a serious contradiction. A city with some of the highest levels of wealth, education, and cultural capital in the country struggling with fundamentals such as keeping businesses open, maintaining public order, and delivering simple infrastructure projects. While it's true that every major city deals with crime and disorder, Maher argues that what makes San Francisco stand out is the overall attitude surrounding these problems. The concern is not just that they exist, but that they seem to occur with an expectation of tolerance, as if consequences are uncertain or optional. That atmosphere, Maher suggests, creates a deeper sense of unease in any individual incident. When people feel that rules are inconsistently enforced or that everyday disruptions are met with resignation rather than action, confidence in the system slowly erodes. Residents and visitors may not express outrage publicly, but over time they adjust their behavior, avoiding certain areas, changing routines, or quietly disengaging. According to Maher, this shift is what turns a city's challenges into a broader cultural warning sign. When coping replaces accountability, even the most admired places begin to lose the trust of the people who are meant to live in them.
San Francisco in the last few years has seen 11 Walgreens and 6 CVS stores just give up and close because that town seems simply beyond law, which is heartbreaking because I, like so many people, love that city, and I don't think it's corny to admit, yes, I left my heart in San Francisco. Also, my wallet and iPhone.
Maher points to situations that many people recognize, even if they've never visited the Bay Area themselves. Stories about people walking into stores, taking items, and leaving without resistance have circulated widely, along with news of major retail chains reducing their presence or closing locations altogether. He isn't presenting charts or crime statistics to make his case. Instead, he's describing a cultural shift that people feel intuitively. When familiar businesses begin pulling out and everyday rules seem inconsistently enforced, the environment changes. The city no longer feels governed by shared expectations and instead starts to resemble a place where order is assumed to be optional rather than standard. That shift feels especially painful because of what San Francisco represents to so many people. It's not just another large city on a map. It's a place filled with personal history and emotional attachment. People fell in love there, started careers there, and arrived with ambition and optimism, believing they were stepping into opportunity. When a city with that kind of meaning begins to feel unstable or neglected, the disappointment runs deeper. Maher uses humor to highlight that sense of loss, not simply to mock, but to emphasize how far expectations and reality seem to have drifted apart. He then turns to the issue of car break-ins, where the situation becomes almost absurd in its own way. Over time, informal workarounds have emerged, not as real solutions, but as coping mechanisms. Advice like parking under bright lights or leaving car doors unlocked in compartments visible reflects how normalized the problem has become. Rather than preventing crime, these strategies are accepted as inevitable and try to minimize damage. Maher highlights this not to ridicule individuals, but to underline a larger concern. When residents adapt their behavior around disorder instead of expecting it to be addressed, it signals a deeper breakdown in confidence about how the city is being managed.
It's glass. Piles and piles of shattered glass everywhere from car windows being smashed. It's so routine to have this happen to any parked car that people purposefully leave the windows down and the glove compartment open so thieves can see there's nothing of value. Or they leave a note on the car politely assuring the thief that there's nothing worth stealing and please don't break the windows.
Maher invites people to think about how strange the situation would sound to someone visiting from outside the city. Imagine welcoming a guest, handing them a hotel key and a map, and then offering advice that amounts to reducing the risk of damage by making their car easier to access. The fact that such guidance even exists points to a deeper issue. Maher's argument is that conditions like this don't develop overnight, and they don't emerge unless the system itself sends a message that enforcement is inconsistent and consequences are uncertain. When people sense that rules are flexible or selectively applied, behavior naturally begins to shift. He connects this to how certain low-level offenses are handled, particularly when theft below a specific dollar amount is treated as a minor issue. His point isn't framed as a moral judgment about people's character, but as an observation about incentives. When limits are clearly defined and penalties are minimal, some individuals will test those limits. That response isn't unusual or shocking. It's a predictable outcome of how people assess risk and reward. Once a threshold is established, it can unintentionally become a guide rather than a deterrent. From Maher's perspective, this turns enforcement into a numbers game rather than a question of right and wrong. When boundaries are set in that way, behavior adapts around them. It stops being about ethics and becomes about calculation, what is allowed, what is unlikely to be punished, and how far one can go without serious consequence. He argues that this dynamic helps explain how situations that once seemed unthinkable slowly become normalized, not because society suddenly changed its values, but because the structure guiding behavior quietly shifted underneath them.
What is so disturbing here is not just that there's more crime and mayhem, it's the audacity of it all. Like there's no lines anymore that can't be crossed. Like don't walk on a stage during a live show.
Maher is careful to acknowledge that issues like poverty, inequality, and long-standing systemic problems are real and serious. He doesn't deny their importance or suggest they have simple explanations. In fact, he recognizes that these challenges require thoughtful, long-term solutions. His argument, however, is that addressing deep social problems does not mean suspending basic expectations of order in the present. A city cannot function on intentions alone. While leaders and institutions work toward broader reforms, everyday rules still matter to the people who live there and move through the city each day. He emphasizes a disconnect that forms when abstract goals are prioritized while daily conditions are ignored. It's difficult to ask working residents for patience and understanding when their immediate environment feels neglected. Navigating broken sidewalks, damaged property, and visible signs of disorder creates frustration that policy language alone cannot resolve. In that sense, Maher suggests that governance isn't only about long-range plans, but also about maintaining a baseline sense of safety and care that people can feel in their daily routines. One of the most striking observations he makes is about the visible aftermath of repeated car break-ins, shattered glass scattered across streets and sidewalks. He gives this phenomenon a darkly memorable nickname, not to trivialize it, but to capture how common it has become. Even without experiencing crime directly, residents are constantly reminded of it through these visual cues. The sound of glass underfoot, the repeated sight of damaged vehicles, and the expectation that this is simply part of city life all contribute to a broader emotional response. This isn't just about property loss, it's about atmosphere. It's a feeling that something is consistently out of balance, that order is fragile, and that attention is lacking. From there, Maher shifts his focus beyond the crimes themselves to the leadership culture he believes allowed this environment to take hold. His concern is less about any single policy and more about the overall tone set by those in charge. When visible problems persist without clear correction, they can begin to feel accepted rather than temporary. According to Maher, this is how a sense of resignation spreads, not through one dramatic failure, but through the steady normalization of conditions that people intuitively know shouldn't be normal at all.
Bay Area citizens have been complaining in recent years about all the human feces in the streets, but Now the streets are full of something else. They call it San Francisco snow. It's glass, piles and piles of shattered glass everywhere from car windows being smashed. It's so routine to have this happen to any parked car that people purposefully leave the windows down and the glove compartment open so thieves can see there's nothing of value. Or they leave a note on the car politely assuring the thief that there's nothing worth stealing and please don't break the windows.
This is where Maher's comedy shifts into a more pointed critique. He suggests that, in some cases, compassion has been misunderstood as the absence of standards. The concern he raises is that when leaders hesitate to enforce basic rules out of fear of appearing harsh, the result isn't greater fairness but growing disorder. In that environment, ordinary residents begin to feel overlooked, while those willing to push boundaries feel increasingly confident. According to Maher, this imbalance creates a quiet but powerful trade-off. Leniency without limits may feel humane in theory, but in practice it can leave many people feeling unprotected in their daily lives. He connects this dynamic to voter frustration, arguing that political shifts often reflect lived experience more than ideology. When everyday life becomes filled with small but constant stresses, worrying about safety, property, or basic order, people tend to lose patience with explanations and long-term promises. They begin to prioritize outcomes over rhetoric. Maher suggests that this is why election results can swing sharply when quality-of-life issues go unresolved. It's not necessarily a rejection of compassionate reform, but a response to the feeling that daily concerns are being dismissed. Maher also addresses a period when calls to reduce or rethink policing became more prominent. His criticism isn't framed as unconditional support for law enforcement or a denial of the need for reform. He acknowledges that improvement, accountability, and training are essential. His point, instead, is about balance. Expecting public safety while simultaneously weakening the institutions responsible for maintaining it creates tension that's difficult to sustain. Morale, staffing, and enforcement are all interconnected, and when the prevailing message suggests a lack of trust or support, fewer people are willing to step into those roles. Those who remain may act more cautiously, unsure of whether they'll be back when decisions are questioned. From Maher's perspective, this hesitation creates a vacuum, and vacuums rarely remain empty. When enforcement becomes inconsistent, responsibility shifts away from institutions and onto individuals. Businesses adjust their practices, residents lower expectations, tourists receive warnings, and people quietly change how they move through the city. Over time, the unspoken rule becomes avoidance rather than engagement. Maher argues that this gradual adaptation is one of the clearest signs that something is wrong. A functioning society, in his view, should not require constant vigilance simply to navigate everyday life, and when it does, it signals a deeper failure that extends beyond any single policy or debate.
The police still need reform, yes, but we can't just allow them to be hunted and targeted for assassination, as has happened over 100 times in 2021. I know there are big issues behind crime, like income inequality and racism that need to be addressed, but let's not get so wrapped up in becoming great again or building back better that we forget not to become El Salvador.
At this point, Maher shifts direction, and that shift is important because San Francisco stops being just a specific place and starts functioning as a broader symbol. He moves away from public safety and focuses on sanitation, arguing that the city's struggles aren't limited to crime alone. The concern, he suggests, is that basic maintenance and cleanliness have also become increasingly difficult to manage. This is where the issue of public cleanliness enters a conversation, a topic that has become so widely discussed that it has taken on a life of its own in popular culture. Maher notes that these stories have spread far beyond local news, turning into jokes and online references that many people recognize instantly. And jokes of that kind don't usually gain traction because something is rare. They spread because they feel familiar enough to be believable. The reputational damage comes from that familiarity. When a city becomes associated with a particular problem to the point that people accept it without questioning the details, the issue is no longer just logistical, it's symbolic. The perception itself becomes part of the problem, shaping how outsiders think about the city before they ever experience it firsthand. He then turns to what seems like a straightforward response to a visible sanitation challenge, the need for more public restrooms. For a dense urban area with large numbers of tourists, commuters, and people without stable housing, this appears to be a practical and reasonable step. On the surface, it sounds like one of the simplest infrastructure projects imaginable. Not a major transportation overhaul or a complex public works initiative. Just a single public restroom meant to serve basic human needs. What makes the example resonate is a reported cost. Maher highlights a figure associated with building one public toilet, and it immediately reframes the discussion. When the price reaches a level that feels far beyond what most people would expect for such a basic facility, it triggers disbelief and frustration. The issue, as Maher presents it, isn't just the expense itself, but what that expense seems to represent. A system so burdened by inefficiency, regulation, or mismanagement that even the simplest solutions become symbols of dysfunction. In that moment, the toilet stops being about sanitation and becomes a shorthand for a much larger concern about governance, priorities, and the growing distance between public expectations and institutional outcomes.
In San Francisco, the city's so nice you'll step in poop twice. There's an area where homeless people were urinating and defecating, and it was starting to annoy the people breaking into cars. So the city tried to build a public toilet last year, but then gave up when the cost hit $1.7 million. Not $1.7 million for a public toilet system. $1.7 million for one toilet. And this wasn't some magic toilet that catches your phone when you drive.
At this stage, Maher's focus shifts away from the restroom itself and toward what it represents. The issue, in his view, isn't really about bathrooms at all, but about bureaucracy. Even without knowing every line item in a city budget, most people recognize the feeling he's describing. There's a shared sense of disbelief when something simple becomes so complicated and costly that it turns into a national talking point. It raises a basic question that resonates widely. How does a system become so inefficient that routine problems turn into public embarrassments? Maher emphasizes this point by noting that, according to the story, a private company eventually offered to build a restroom at no cost. On paper, that should have resolved the issue. Instead, layers of fees, oversight requirements, and administrative processes were added until the free project carried an enormous price tag. The details matter less than the impression it leaves. To many people, it feels like an example of a system that can't accept a straightforward solution without burying it under complexity. What begins as an attempt to help ends up reinforcing the sense that nothing can move forward without being slowed, reshaped, and made more expensive along the way. Maher uses humor to capture how this experience feels to ordinary residents. The frustration isn't just financial, it's emotional. People start to feel trapped in a process that's opaque, rigid, and unresponsive, where common sense seems secondary to procedure. When every step comes with added conditions and costs, trust erodes. His comparison isn't meant to be literal but illustrative. A city that starts to feel less like a place designed to serve its residents and more like a system where every interaction comes with fine print. In that framing, the joke lands because it reflects a real concern that governance has become so tangled in its own rules that even the simplest needs turn into exercises in endurance rather than service.
So then a private company took pity on San Francisco and offered to build them their toilet for free. But after, quote, project management, construction management, architecture and engineering fees, permits, civic design review, surveys, contract preparation, and cost estimation, the free toilet was still going to cost almost $1 million. You know, if you tack on fees like that, you're not a city, you're an airline.
This leads to Maher's deeper criticism, which goes beyond the price tag of any single project. His concern is that the system itself appears structured to protect its own processes rather than to deliver results. The accumulation of reviews, committees, consultants, and repeated rounds of public discussion can begin to feel self-perpetuating. Each step justifies the next, creating a cycle where activity replaces progress. Over time, the focus shifts away from solving problems and toward maintaining the appearance of careful consideration, even when that consideration never produces a decision. Maher uses humor to highlight how this dynamic affects public confidence. He often returns to the idea of public input, not to dismiss its importance, but to question how it is used. Democratic participation and community voices clearly matter, but when public input becomes a reason to delay action indefinitely, it stops serving the public. Instead, it creates stagnation. In that environment, People don't feel empowered or included. They feel stuck inside a system that talks constantly but rarely moves forward. The result is a city that seems oddly proud of its inability to act, where years of debate can end with cancellation and no clear accountability. From there, Maher connects his bureaucratic culture to one of the city's most serious challenges: housing. He argues that it is impossible to address homelessness, street conditions, and affordability without confronting how difficult it has become to build new housing. According to his critique, San Francisco has layered so many requirements and approval stages onto development that construction itself has become unusually slow, expensive, and uncertain. When building is consistently delayed or discouraged, fewer homes are added to the market. The consequences are predictable. Supply remains limited, prices stay high, and pressure on residents intensifies. Maher frames this not as ideology, but as basic arithmetic. If creating housing is made excessively difficult, the shortage deepens, and the crisis continues regardless of intentions.
It feels like San Francisco is actually proud of being impossible. Asked about the toilet, a spokesman for the Department of Public Works said, "We are a city of public input." Okay, but I'm stepping in public output. Meanwhile, the median time to get approval to build a house there is 627 days. That's 217 days longer than it took to build the Empire State Building. You need 87 permits, 15 from the Planning Commission, 26 from the Public Utilities Commission and the Fire Department, 19 from building inspectors, 17 from the Public Works, 10 related to public spaces, and 1 from a guy in a T-shirt that says Federal Inspector.
Maher ends this part of the argument with an observation that is meant to underline the imbalance he sees in how the city operates. He suggests that while San Francisco struggles to build enough housing for the people who need it, it shows remarkable efficiency when it comes to creating layers of administration. The contrast is striking. Processes move quickly, paperwork multiplies, and new requirements appear with ease, even as real-world problems remain unresolved. The point he's making isn't about mocking effort, but about priorities. When systems become better at managing themselves and addressing lived conditions, the gap between governance and daily life becomes impossible to ignore. From there, Maher turns his attention to leadership and how it presents itself. He describes a style that feels highly polished, procedural, and tightly managed, emphasizing structure and messaging over tangible outcomes. His joke about not worrying about artificial intelligence because decision-making already feels automated is meant to highlight a sense of detachment. In this model of leadership, everything is filtered through processes, frameworks, task forces, and stakeholder meetings. While those tools have their place, Maher argues that they can feel insufficient when people are dealing with immediate problems that require direct action. The frustration he points to comes from this disconnect. When residents experience issues like property damage or public disorder, they are not looking for terminology or long-term frameworks in that moment. They are looking for responsiveness and accountability. Maher's critique suggests that when leadership relies too heavily on abstract language and procedural distance, it risks appearing disconnected from the everyday realities people are facing. In that environment, even well-intentioned governance can start to feel impersonal, leaving the public with a sense that systems are functioning smoothly on paper while practical concerns remain unanswered on the ground.
It's no wonder that in 2021, San Francisco issued only 2,000 permits for new homes. Sure, there are people living in the streets, but that's because we want to make sure the apartments they don't live in are perfect. I don't fear AI anymore because it couldn't possibly be any more robotic than the humans who run things now.
This, ultimately, is a frustration driving Maher's entire argument. His pointing to the growing distance between the language used by leadership and the realities people experience on the ground. When officials speak in polished phrases about systems, frameworks, and progress, but residents are navigating boarded-up shopfronts, damaged property, and declining services, confidence begins to erode. Trust depends on alignment between words and lived experience. When that alignment breaks, people stop engaging with the narrative being offered to them, not out of cynicism, but out of exhaustion. Maher uses broad imagery and analogy to capture what he sees as a larger cultural problem. His goal isn't to demand agreement on every detail, but to highlight a pattern, a society that had become so burdened by rules, delays, and symbolic gestures that accomplishing basic tasks now feels unusually difficult. He acknowledges that regulation has value. Safety standards matter. Environmental and accessibility considerations serve real purposes. The issue, as he frames it, is balance. When every safeguard turns into an obstacle and every decision becomes a prolonged process, momentum disappears. At that point, the system no longer feels like it exists to serve people but to preserve itself. What gives a critique its emotional weight is what lies beneath the humor. It's easy to laugh at exaggerated examples or memorable phrases, but behind them is a sense of loss. San Francisco is a city many people care deeply about, whether they live there or simply admire what it once represented. When a place with that much history, creativity, and promise start to be discussed as a warning rather than an inspiration, it signals something deeper than policy failure. Maher's point is not just about inefficiency or mismanagement, but about the sadness of watching beloved cities slowly become a symbol of what happens when good intentions lose contact with everyday reality.
So let me finish with this. Not that there was ever any reason to build it in the first place, and not that there would be any reason to do it again. But just as an exercise in realizing how far we've regressed as the can-do people, I think we should all try to imagine how it will go down if we tried to sculpt Mount Rushmore out of a mountain today. First, we'd have to make the mountain handicap accessible, so we could hire handicapped people to work on the side of a mountain. Then there'd be a 10-year delay while we studied the effect of construction noise on the mating habits of woodchucks. Then another 10 years to obtain ethnically sourced dynamite and find a sculptor who doesn't only work from home.
Whether someone sees Maher's critique as precise or overstated, it leaves a broader question unresolved. Why does it increasingly feel as though some leaders struggle to deliver basic, everyday functions? And for viewers looking for a clear solution, the reality is uncomfortable. There isn't a single fix that addresses everything at once. Complex urban problems rarely respond to simple answers. They require a combination of approaches, including rules that are consistently enforced, compassion that doesn't drift into inaction, and administrative systems that are efficient enough to allow cities to respond to real needs. Effective leadership, in this view, is less about messaging and appearance and more about measurable outcomes. Maher also points to the role of normalization in long-term decline. When disorder becomes familiar, people slowly adjust their expectations. Activities that once felt routine begin to feel risky or inconvenient. Individuals change their habits, businesses hesitate to invest, and visitors choose other destinations. Over time, this quiet withdrawal reinforces the very problems that cause it, creating a cycle that's difficult to reverse. The danger, as Maher frames it, isn't just the presence of dysfunction, but the gradual loss of belief that things can improve at all. He closes by inviting broader reflection rather than prescribing a final answer. Is San Francisco simply the most visible example of challenges facing many large cities, or has it reached a particularly extreme version of that struggle? And for those who have experienced the city firsthand, does its current reality match its reputation, or has online amplification distorted the picture? These questions matter because they shape how people talk about cities, invest in them, and imagine their future. Maher's argument ultimately isn't about winning a debate, but about urging people to reconsider what they are willing to accept as normal, and whether accepting it quietly risks making decline permanent.